I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, with a tie of 33 Republicans to 33 DFLers, the 94th session of the Minnesota Senate is starting off in an unusual place. Because neither party has a majority, the two are working together in unprecedented ways to kick off the new legislative year. I sat down with party leadership to talk about the unique challenges and opportunities this session presents.
I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat. It really is a fascinating time in Minnesota politics right now.
I start every session having had the break of an interim to reflect on where we have been, to listen carefully to the people of Minnesota, and I hope my colleagues have done the same and come back to work on the 14th ready to do that work with one another.
Thanks to a special election during the interim, we'll see one new face at the start of this session. Tonight, you get to meet our newest senator.
Spending decisions that are made this legislative session will have impacts on the planning years, and we are anticipating some challenges in those years.
Plus, a look at Minnesota's financial future and the role legislators will play. That's all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
DFL Senator Aaron Murphy served as Majority Leader for the Senate last session and is leading the DFL caucus this session as well. Senator, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
Good morning. So this session is starting in unfamiliar territory with a vacant seat and a special election called for by Governor Walz for the 28th. How is that impacting your caucus and leadership currently?
I think it's right for us to begin in acknowledging Senator Dietzig, former Majority Leader, my predecessor, and a respected and deeply treasured member of the Minnesota Senate. And we lost her about a week ago, and it has created a vacancy for us. Our caucus is still getting our feet on the ground about the loss of Carrie, and we know we have a job to do for the people of Minnesota. So we're grateful that there's a special election underway, and we're working now to make sure that we're able to conduct the work of the people in these 3 weeks when the Senate finds itself evenly divided before we regain our majority in that special election on the 28th.
All right. Do you foresee this having any impacts on how the Senate works or the flow downstream, so after January?
Well, I'm a generally optimistic person, and I like to take lessons from every single election because it's Minnesotans who put us in these seats, and it's our job then to use the privilege and the responsibilities of serving to deliver for them. And our caucus has been uniquely focused on what do we need to do for the people of Minnesota, because we know in many ways they are struggling with affording their lives, whether it is the cost of their health care or child care, college for their kids, a safe home. Their day-to-day expenses are high. We took serious action to tackle those things in the last biennium and in the last budget, and we're going to persist there for the people of Minnesota. So I think that the moment that we find ourselves in is a moment for us to reach across the aisle, as we do, and to invite our Republican colleagues into using these 3 weeks, these first 3 weeks, to make sure that we're doing the work and we're not getting hung up in gridlock, because a budget session, which we're entering into, goes fast, and we need to do the work for the people of Minnesota and finish up on time.
So with the absence of the DFL trifecta, how is that going to impact what we see coming out of the Senate this session?
We know that across the state, Minnesotans are counting on us to make sure that we're doing all that we can using the tools of the government to make life a little easier for people. And as I talk with people in the district I represent, we had a town hall right before the holiday, or across the state, they talk a lot about feeling like things are a little out of control, like the health insurance industry is denying care and they're paying a lot of money out of their pockets and not getting what they need for themselves or their family. And I think they want us to act to make sure that that power equation is balanced. If you're paying your premiums, you should get the care that you deserve and that you've contracted for, and right now people don't feel like that's happening.
With the slim margins across the legislature, does that mean we might see more bipartisanship this session?
I think bipartisanship is always a focus, but I would call it instead our commitment together to get work done for the people of Minnesota. And we have seen that in the Senate year after year, and there were lots of examples of that, especially as we did our work in our committees and as our bills came to the floor. So I would expect that we continue to see that. because we are going to be, in very narrow margins in both bodies. There will be a drive to the issues that I think we resonate together on, things like mental health care, EMS, public school funding, and again, doing things that we can to make sure that Minnesotans have control over their own lives.
Looking back at the previous session, what stands out to you?
The last session, this last biennium, we did a tremendous amount of work with the gift of a governing majority that Minnesotans gave us. And we focused a lot on Minnesotans and their pocketbooks. So when I think about things like the child tax credit, or universal school meals, or the North Star Promise Act, all things that put more real money in people's pockets. If you put together the child tax credit and universal school meals for an average family of 4 with 2 kids, families are saving thousands of dollars a year. Those things were important. They are important. They're economic drivers for people, and they are, I think, a statement of our values. And when I think about the work that we did over the last 2 years, it will have a transformative impact on the lives of people and on the future of Minnesota for generations to come. Those are things worth protecting.
And so you're talking about protecting them. Do you have any plans to further those in this coming session?
Well, I think we're going to continue to look at the ways that we can make life more affordable for people. For instance, Senator Liz Bolden took decisive action along with our colleagues on medical debt. And I think there's another chapter to be written on medical debt for the people of Minnesota. We have started exploring the ways in which the health insurance industry in particular, but other likely situated industries that partner with the government to make sure that they are fulfilling their promises to the people of Minnesota. We'll continue to do that work.
What are your caucus's priorities this session?
I think that we are thinking a lot about housing, childcare, things that we started working on last session, where we know people are having a hard time affording rent, affording childcare, affording college, affording the day-to-day expenses of their lives. We're going to continue on that path for people.
So what challenges are you anticipating for this session, and do you have any plans on how to maneuver around them?
I start every session having had the break of an interim to reflect on where we have been, to listen carefully to the people of Minnesota, and I hope my colleagues have done the same and come back to work on the 14th ready to do that work with one another.
Will this session provide your caucus with any unique opportunities?
Every session provides unique opportunities. We have a big class of first-term members. I think 14 of our 34 members are first-term members. They bring really powerful leadership, not only to our caucus, but to regions across the state of Minnesota.
So as a final thought, what is your message for Minnesotans going into this session?
We hear you, that there are parts of life that are very difficult, that some are doing very, very well in the state of Minnesota, corporations, the very wealthy, but lots of people are struggling with the day-to-day expenses of life. We understand that. It is important to us that we put our focus there, that our caucus is deeply committed to the well-being of Minnesotans across the state of Minnesota, to communities across the state of Minnesota, to their well-being, to their jobs, and their ability to earn and support themselves in the way that they choose.
Thank you, Senator. There's a new DFL face in the Minnesota Senate this session, but it's one we've seen before. Last June, District 45 Senator Kelly Morrison announced she was resigning her state Senate seat to campaign for a U.S. congressional position. After a special election, former state Senator Ann Johnson Stewart was elected to fill the vacant seat. Senate media was there when Stewart took her official oath of office. Have a look.
I'm Ann Johnson Stewart, once again Senator, and it's just a really joyful day for me. Being in the Senate chamber again you saw me, I just kind of exploded with emotion because it's a good place to be with really good people. Being able to do it again is just unbelievable. That I feel very grateful. Frankly, I'm looking forward to all of it. I hope to work on infrastructure. I hope to reconnect with my caucus. I'm really, really hoping to return to the bonding committee, the transportation committee. I'd love to work on jobs again. As you know, that's kind of my life passion is workforce development in the construction industry. But I will have to wait. So we'll develop our plan. I know we're doing that soon, and we'll see what's next.
Johnson Stewart now represents the 45th District, which includes parts of Minnetonka, Orono, and Wayzata. A familiar face is leading the Republican caucus this session. I'm now joined by Republican Senator Mark Johnson, who was elected by his party to serve as the minority leader last session. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Hey, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. So this session is starting off with a lot of uncertainties. What's helping you and your team navigate these unknowns?
Uncertainties is a nice way of putting it. I mean, it just seems like chaos from day to day around here with the House that's really just trying to figure out its path forward with quorum and membership over there. But the Senate seems to be a little bit more tame on our side, where we are tied currently at 33-33 with the unfortunate passing of our dear friend Senator Dietzich. So we're also in discussions with Democrats on figuring out what the first day of session looks like. Right now, we're right in the midst of those, but I will say that they are going fairly well from both sides, and so I'm optimistic that we can get together on Tuesday and have a really settled start to the session.
Now, Senator, despite all of those unknowns or chaos, as you put it, that we're starting the session with, you are you add stability to this process for your party because you were in leadership role last session and you're in leadership this session. So what did you learn during that time that's helping you move forward now?
Yeah, so it's a great honor to be elected again to that leadership role. Some say sentenced again to that leadership role, but it's really an honor to be there. And so over the last 2 years, we've built up relationships in different ways with Senate Democrats. The first 2 years were a bit rocky as they had the trifecta and really didn't have an interest in working with Republicans. Now that we're tied, it's really forced us to work with Democrats and vice versa, the Democrats that come over and try to figure out how it works together with a shared power. So I'm hoping, based on those 2 years of interactions, that we can build those bridges now going forward and get something done for Minnesotans that they are really feeling part of the process once again, where they haven't been for the last 2 years.
All right, Senator, what would you describe the environment as like in your caucus right now?
You know, that's one thing that I'm very proud of. Our caucus, despite their differences, we've got people from the metro and far north and far south Minnesota. But I think we're very unified on our principles of focusing on Minnesotans and what they're asking for within our districts. And so we've been doing, just as a caucus, very, very tight on our mission there. So I'm excited about whatever it is that this session brings. I know with confidence that we have a team right there that's going to be able to address those issues. So yeah, it's a great environment to be part of.
You mentioned that your caucus is listening to what Minnesotans are asking for. What is your caucus asking you for?
Yeah, I think really what they want to see is an ability to communicate with Democrats and bring those needs forward. And now that we're in a very split environment right now, and it seems uncertain whether it's losing a member of our family, Senate family here with Senator Dietzich, or on the Democrat side, there is an issue there with one of their members in the legal trouble there. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So how do we bring a mission forward? How do we bring our team forward, their concerns, working with Democrats and getting those issues addressed? And so that's what they're asking from me is let's lead through this maze and figure out how we get those things done.
What is something that your team accomplished last session that you guys were most proud of?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is the unity within our team, addressing Minnesotans' concerns despite the trifecta and what was happening there with Democrats both in the House and the Senate and the governor's office. And they stayed very unified on message through that and trying to get their issues through as well. We were able to get a few things done, but also stop some of the more egregious issues that were coming down the pipe, like tax increases and some of the mandates that they were looking at. So we were able to navigate away from a few of those things too. But it was a very difficult environment dealing with that trifecta. But I feel like our team did a really, really good job through that.
Now that was last session, so what are your priorities for this coming session?
With all the chaos that's going around, right? So we don't know if we're able to organize on Tuesday, where do we send those bills if we're able to pass them out of the Senate? The House may or may not be organized at that point, and what that looks like, and who's going to be chairs. So it's really a fascinating time. I mean, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat. It really is a fascinating time in Minnesota politics right now. And so our focus is really making sure that we can get, organized if that's going to be possible. But our focus is on Minnesotans' needs. I think for too long, while the trifecta was in place, it was about how they grow government, how they can increase mandates, how they can increase taxes. But now that Republicans are back in with some control, it'll be, let's refocus on the priorities of this state. And that's Minnesotans' needs. And so that's really what we're going to be focusing on.
Do you think with the loss of the DFL trifecta, as you mentioned a couple times, that will change how business is done in the Senate this session, or what comes out of it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Whereas before, we really didn't have a role to play, it seemed like. As Democrats, we're only negotiating with Democrats because they knew that they only had to get it past the Democrat House. They only had to get the Democrat governor to sign it. Now they have to take into account Republicans' interests and needs more than they ever have, because they realize that they've got to get our votes. And so this is going to be an opportunity for us to really insert our needs and our constituents' needs in those discussions. And so I'm very optimistic that this dynamic change is going to benefit Minnesota. It's not going to stop things, but what it will do is make sure that packages that come through are things that people that they agree with, both on Democrat and Republican sides. And that's called a compromise. That's legislation. That's the way it should be done.
And you just mentioned compromise, and we know that we're going into a budget year, so there are going to be some disagreements. But do you think there are some things that will come across the desk this year that you guys universally align on?
Yeah, I think there have been some ideas that have been floated. There's been some permitting reform issues. There's been some mandate reform issues that I think have some bipartisan agreement. I think there are a number of ways that we can look at this throughout our committees, both in whether it's health or tax or even environment issues. I think there's a number of issues that just recently they're starting to talk about bipartisan issues that I'm very optimistic that we can get done this session.
What excites you the most about this upcoming session?
The change, right? So we've got all these things that are hard to really quantify, to grasp right now on where we're going to land, but the possibilities are endless this session. So I know it's hard to see a clear pathway through, and likewise, I don't see how we get necessarily to the end, but I do know that we will get there. And so it really just opens up those options for Minnesotans to make sure that we can get those things done that we hadn't been able to over the last 2 years. So for me, even though it is a little bit of a gray area, it's fun to be part of that and to be in that and to be able to form what this session looks like. And so we're right there, and I'm buckling up, grab some popcorn. It's going to be a very interesting session going forward.
Senator, if you had a message for Minnesotans right before we start this session, what would that be? What do they need to hear from you?
Yeah, I think right now, what Minnesotans have seen over the last 2 years is really a focus away, like we talked about, from the needs of families, from the needs of communities, from the needs of our education system, to just governmental, bureaucratic desires. There's going to be a shift. We're going to go back. We're going to be focusing on what Minnesotans are concerned about, just their daily lives, their education of their children. Those are the things that need to be really focused on. And I am so excited to make sure that we can really influence and put the needs of Minnesotans first once again.
Senator, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You can find my interviews with the Republican and DFL party leadership in their entirety on our Senate Media YouTube channel at MN Senate Media. They'll be posted on our Facebook page as well. The Senate Finance Committee discussed the social impact of legalizing online sports betting this week. Authors of recent studies on the subject and experts on gambling addiction testified before the committee during a hearing.
I started digging into this world of sports gambling without the emotional investment and without the frustration that I carry with me now. And I did that by reading everything I could, speaking with everyone I could. I even attended meetings. I attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I attended annual meetings to just try to understand this industry a little bit more. And what I soon realized was this was not about the risk-free bet. This was a public health disaster that was destroying real lives and real families. And I've now become a magnet for unfortunately desperate people who've lost everything and their families due to addicted sports gambling.
If I'm in a state that has legalized online sports betting, the average bankruptcy filings increased by a quarter over several years? Statewide,
Yes.
It's not just for gamblers, but for statewide, the bankruptcy rate.
Yes, yes, that's the correct interpretation.
I appreciate the perspective, especially insofar as we're trying to protect certain Minnesotans from harm. We do that as a state government without trying to intrude. The simple fact is, we have had testimony this morning largely ignoring the fact that many Minnesotans want to do this.
Just before this meeting, committee members held a press conference on the topic as well. You can watch that on our Minnesota Senate Media Services YouTube channel.
What we're seeing for the first time in this forecast is that the structural imbalance is expected to grow in fiscal years 28-29, resulting in a projected deficit in that biennium. Clearly, a deficit of this magnitude would prove to be a considerable challenge for future lawmakers. But here in Minnesota, we have the benefit of forecasting over a 4-year window, giving us access to an incredibly valuable resource, which is time.
This session, senators are preparing the budget for the 2026-2027 fiscal year. The state's budget and economic forecast, released in November, predicts the biennium will end with a surplus. But by 2028, the state is expected to start spending more than it's bringing in, creating a nearly $6 billion deficit. Now, legislators are sharing their thoughts on how to balance the budget.
We expect an available balance in fiscal years 26-27 of $616 million. That is $1.1 billion less than we had projected at the end of the 2024 legislative session.
It's less than originally projected, but Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Erin Campbell says the state will end its next budget cycle with a surplus. Beyond that, however,
Minnesota is facing some significant economic and financial headwinds. Spending growth continues to exceed revenues throughout the budget horizon, and this structural imbalance continues into the planning years, creating a projected deficit in the FY 28-29 biennium.
For the first time ever, Minnesota's management and budget team released projections 4 years out, and what it found was a looming deficit. The main culprits, inflation and state spending outpacing its revenue.
Spending is projected to grow from $67 billion to $73.4 billion. Of that growth, $1.3 billion is a result of accounting for 2 additional years of discretionary inflation.
As the pandemic has ebbed and stimulus spending has fallen, states across the nation, including Minnesota, began seeing revenues return closer to pre-pandemic levels. While revenue is still projected to grow, we are seeing that in both biennia, projected spending is set to outpace forecast revenues, led by spending for long-term care services, as for people with disabilities, as well as special education services. When you look at the revenue forecast, we project lower than previously expected revenues from income and sales taxes, which are Minnesota's largest tax categories.
For many years, consumers have been allocating increasingly smaller portions of their budgets to goods and increasingly larger portions of their budgets to services, including housing and healthcare services. The shift in spending from goods to services has implications for the state's sales tax revenues.
But to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Now, senators are starting the session readied with new information. It's a challenge, they say, they're prepared to take on.
The spending that was passed over the last 2 years, as the forecast shows, is just unsustainable. It's unsustainable for Minnesotan families. We are number 46 when it comes to state and local tax burden across the country. Minnesota families can't afford this anymore. We're facing a massive deficit. And education and healthcare are a big part of that, but it's half of the change that we saw presented today. And we still have another $500 million that's being impacted. We need to focus first and foremost on waste, fraud, and abuse. We can't just look at balancing this 2-year cycle. We do a 4-year cycle just for that very reason, so that we're not scrambling and that we're very thoughtful and planful about how we address future budgets.
Whether we are facing structural surplus or structural imbalance, that we know our job is to balance the budget, and we're going to do that with our values at the center. We have been in this place before. I remember my second or third term, we had a $6 billion budget deficit. And we worked with Minnesotans, and we worked with legislators and the administration at the time to make sure that we could balance the budget. It was very, very difficult work, but we did it. We've got our eyes set on the budget that we need to set for these next 2 years. We're in strong financial position to do that work. We will have our eye on the next 28 and 29. We have to. We have to understand what's driving it, and we have to understand how to rectify that. We will do that work.
So while there's a deficit on the horizon, there's hope to avoid it too.
Not only do we have advance notice to spot a problem on the horizon, we also have ample time to take action and change the trajectory.
An updated forecast will be released in February. Experts say that forecast will factor in anticipated impacts of proposed economic policies, such as tariffs, budget cuts, or federal tax policies. When it comes to the Capitol, you may be familiar with the name Cass Gilbert. He's the architect who designed Minnesota's state capitol. But there's another man you may not know who built the Capitol Lego brick by brick.
It is kind of this epic Lego model that people are fascinated just by the scale, the size of it. And it really is a fun way to tell the story about Minnesota's state capitol. We have our Lego model of the Minnesota state capitol, and it's a big part of kind of the interpretation that we do for not only for kids but adults. It's pretty close to scale. It's over probably 300 pounds of weight with all the Lego. We estimate 75,000 bricks. This was put together by Roy Cook, who was a U of M professor, but also at that time a Lego ambassador. We worked with him. He spent about 150 hours designing and actually building. So it's really a remarkable testament to his skill and his patience. The rule is you can't alter or cut or remove things on a brick. So everything you see in this model would be something that would be in a kit that Lego has made. So if you look at the dome, we have in real life eagles above those columns, but Lego doesn't make eagles, or at least they didn't at that time. So these are Hedwig owls from the Harry Potter set. And so that's really kind of the part of that genius of putting all these pieces together to make it look as you have the details throughout the entire state capitol using Lego. This is the architect, Cass Gilbert. And then John Johnson was our governor, the 16th governor of Minnesota when the building opened. He was the first to serve a term of office in the Capitol. So we have Cass Gilbert and our governor, John Johnson.
If you'd like to see the Lego Capitol model, it'll be on display in the Capitol's ground floor east corridor from January 13th through the 24th. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.